Somewhere in the early 12th century, 3 scholars leave Bodh Gaya, the holiest ground in Buddhism, the place where the Buddha himself woke up. Her lineage remembers why they came. Word had crossed the Himalayas about a woman in Tibet teaching a Buddhist system whose authority did not begin with an Indian text or an Indian master or any transmission the scholars could trace. It came from her. For as long as Buddhism had flourished in Tibet, religious authority had mostly flowed one way. India taught, Tibet received. That was the direction the river flowed. So these men climbed into mountains that killed travelers every winter to test her teaching in person, and if she failed, to expose it before it spread any further. To understand why they crossed the highest mountains on earth for one woman, you need her name. Machig Labdrön. And you need the name of what she built, a practice Tibet still speaks of carefully, whose name means one thing: to cut. Chöd. But first, we have to go back 50 years, to a dream in which a mother's heart was cut out of her chest and eaten, and she woke up smiling. One thing before we begin. Like many Tibetan masters, Machig Labdrön reaches us through a namtar, a sacred biography. A namtar doesn't separate history, vision, and meaning the way a modern biography would. It was never trying to. So today we tell her story the way her lineage preserved it, and I'll tell you when the difference matters. Southern Tibet. The year is 1054. A noblewoman named Boomcham falls asleep, and the dreams begin. 4 women in white descend from the sky carrying 4 white vases. They pour nectar over her from head to toe, and she feels herself washed clean. Then 7 more appear, red, yellow, green, surrounding her with offerings, saying, "Honor the mother. Stay well, our mother-to-be." And then the sky changes. A woman the color of deep midnight steps forward. She wears ornaments carved from human bone. In one hand, a hooked knife. In the other, a cup made from a skull. She looks at Boomcham and says, "Now I will take out this ignorant heart." The knife comes down. She lifts the heart from Boomcham's chest, places it in the skull cup, and the 5 of them eat it. Then she blows a white conch shell, and the sound rolls across the whole world. Where the heart had been, she sets the conch in its place. Boomcham wakes up. No terror, no scream. Her biography says she woke in bliss. Hold on to that image. Decades later, the child conceived that Night would build a spiritual practice in which she imagined her own body becoming a feast. Her mother saw it first. The child arrived in 1055. Her biography records 2 signs. She was born with a 3rd eye, already open at her brow, and in other tellings the sacred syllable ah, shining at the same spot. And moments after birth, she sat upright and asked if her mother was well. Her first act in this world was concern for someone else. Her mother saw the eye and panicked, a deformity, something to hide. Her father looked closer and recognized what Tibetans call the wisdom eye. He hid her too, the way you hide a treasure. 2 centuries earlier, tradition says, the legendary master who helped establish Tantric Buddhism in Tibet made a prediction about a girl like this. Remember that. It comes back. This was 11th century Tibet, in the middle of Buddhism's great second wave. New translations moving north, teachers crossing the passes in both directions. Somewhere on these same mountains, a yogi named Milarepa was singing in the caves. And hidden inside a chieftain's house, a little girl with 3 eyes was learning to read. In medieval Tibet, reading scripture out loud was a profession, a paid one. Wealthy families sponsored recitations of the great texts to generate merit, blessing, protection, good karma for the household. They hired professional readers the way you'd hire a musician. A reader in that world was part scholar, part voice actor, part endurance athlete, and one who could complete an enormous scripture in a single sitting, quickly and beautifully, booked out. By her early teens, the most sought-after reader in the region was a girl. The Namtar gives the numbers, reciting mantras at 3 years old, reading at 5, and at 8, the Prajnaparamita in 8,000 lines, the perfection of wisdom. A text that spends thousands of verses dismantling one assumption, that anything, including the self, exists independently, permanently, with the solid essence we project onto it. She could recite it at a speed people refused to believe. The local king tested her himself, walked away stunned, and gave her the name she carries through history, Labdrön, the lamp of Lab. Her formal teacher Lama Drapa made her his official reader. So picture her working life, someone's home, a patron who wants merit, and this girl, chanting the emptiness of the self at full speed for money. She earned her living reciting that the self is empty, years before she walked into the dark to find out whether she believed it. Then a teacher named Kyoten Sunam Lama called her bluff. His challenge cut straight through her reputation. Reciting wisdom is not the same as seeing what it points to. Stop treating the scripture as an object outside yourself. Examine the mind doing the reading. A violinist can play the same concerto for 10 years, for rent, for applause, and then one night, mid-performance, actually hear it. The piece she thought she knew opens underneath her like a trapdoor. Tradition says that is what happened to Machig, and it names the exact place in the text where it happened. She was reading the passage on demons. The words opened. Realization arose. Attachment to home, to status, to comfort began dissolving on its own. No retreat, no ritual. The text did what the text says it does. By her early 20s, people whispered that the reader girl had become something more. A holy woman, maybe a saint in the making. Tibet was ready to build her a pedestal. Instead, it was about to tear one down. One night, Machig dreamed of a dark-skinned master from India, a wandering yogi with burning eyes. The story says that same night, far away, the master dreamed of her. The next morning, he was standing in her courtyard. His name was Dampa Sangye, one of the great Mahasiddhas, the wild enlightened wanderers of India. He had crossed into Tibet again and again, teaching a path he called the pacification of suffering. Later Tibetan tradition remembers this meeting as something far larger than two strangers with matching dreams. It says these two had met before, centuries before. That Dampa Sangye was Padma Sambhava returned, and that Machig was Yeshe Tsogyal, Tibet's first great female master, come back to finish what she started. The prediction from the beginning of our story, walking through her front gate. Whether you read that literally or symbolically, what he gave her that day changed everything. 5 instructions, her lineage treasures them to this day. Listen to how strange they are. Confess your hidden faults. Approach what you find repulsive. Help those you think you cannot help. Let go of anything you are attached to. Go to the places that scare you. Hold on to that last one. Her entire life is inside it. Soon after came another prophecy, this one from Tahra, the goddess of compassion we've met before on this channel. It foretold an Indian yogi named Topa Bhadra. At 23, Machig met him. They became tantric consorts, and then children. And Tibet turned on her. The holy prodigy, the girl with the wisdom eye, living with a foreign yogi, pregnant, ordinary. The whispers survive in the record. The saint had fallen. The blessing was wasted. Scholars who study her life describe a woman caught between a society's expectations and a path that refused to fit them. Her realization now had to survive an arena that sacred biographies usually hurry past. Partnership, poverty, motherhood, responsibility. The family lived in hardship, and the community that had once paid for her voice turned its back. And then, around 35, she made the hardest cut of her life, years before cutting became the center of her teaching. She left. Topa Bhadra, the children, the household. Her biographers wrestle with it to this day, the way biographers wrestle with every renunciate who was also a parent. She left the household and went back to Dampa Sangye, the master from the courtyard, the one who had given her the 5 instructions in the first place. She asked him for more teachings. He refused, not as punishment. He told her he had already given her his most profound teachings. There was nothing left to hand over. The woman others called fallen had reached the end of what her teachers could give her. And while Tibet gossiped about her, word of her had not yet crossed the mountains. It would. Every culture has places it will not go after dark. In Tibet, the most feared were the charnel grounds, landscapes of corpses and sky burial, where the dead are given back to the vultures piece by piece. Places of wandering spirits. Places where the physical reality of death sits out in the open, where nobody has hidden it. Tibetans crossed valleys to avoid them. Machig moved in. Head shaved, possessions gone, she became a wandering yogini, sleeping where night found her, eating what strangers offered. She lived among the outcasts, beggars, lepers, the people Tibet looked past, and she went looking for the haunted valleys, the cursed springs, the grounds of the dead. Anywhere fear lived, she made camp. And out there, the 5th instruction turned into something far bigger. What formed around her teachings took a Tibetan name that means cutting. Severance. You already know it. Chöd. In one of Chöd's central visualizations, the practitioner sits alone at night in a place of fear. A drum, the damaru, begins to beat. Then a trumpet sounds, the kangling, carved from a human thigh bone. A voice from the dead, calling across the darkness like a dinner bell. The kangling is not subtle. That is the point. Then one syllable cuts through it all. Fet, the sound that severs. And the practitioner imagines her own consciousness shooting up through the crown of her head and transforming. She becomes a wrathful Dakini, a sky dancer with a hooked knife. The knife sweeps down and severs the top of her own skull. The skull cap falls and widens into a cauldron the size of a valley. Her body goes in, fire underneath. Flesh and bone cook down into shining nectar, a feast without end. Then she invites the guests, enlightened ones, protectors, wandering ghosts, karmic creditors, every being she has ever harmed in any lifetime, and every single thing she fears. Come, eat, take as much as you want. Now you see it, the heart in the skull cup, the Dakini's feasting. Her mother dreamed this ritual before Machig ever existed. But understand what is happening out there in the dark. The terror is only the arena. The engine is compassion, and Machig said so directly. Love, compassion, and the vow to wake up for the sake of every being. Those 3, she taught, are the living root of her whole system. Without them, Chöd is horror theater. With it, the feast is the perfection of wisdom made physical. Generosity pushed to its absolute limit, the gift of the body itself. Compassion extended to the exact beings a sane person runs from. And underneath it all, the blade goes into the deepest attachment a human being has, the ownership of this body, this self, this me. The terror serves one purpose. In a charnel ground at midnight, with the kangling still ringing, you cannot fake it. One boundary, and the tradition drew it long before I did. Chöd is an advanced practice, learned through qualified instruction, transmission, and empowerment. What you're hearing is its logic, never an invitation to improvise the ritual alone. Chöd is not a dare. Enter that darkness unprepared, and the fear you meant to cut can leave stronger than it came. And an honest note, Machig didn't conjure this from nothing. Cutting practices circulated among the Indian Mahasiddhas before her. Dampa Sangye is remembered as the father of Chöd, and the bone tradition preserves a cutting lineage of its own. What Machig did was forge those strands into the distinctive system that carries her name, which is why, 9 centuries later, the tradition calls her its mother. A modern comparison would be a controlled burn, walking toward the wildfire and setting a smaller fire on your own terms, so the great one arrives and finds nothing left to consume. But the analogy stops there. Machig wasn't asking how to survive the fire. She was asking who, exactly, believed they were burning. And she had known the answer for years. Long before the charnel grounds, tradition says, she had already discovered what feeding could do. It happened during an empowerment ceremony. Machig sat in deep meditation, and the story says she lifted from her seat, passed straight through the temple wall, and came to rest outside, in the branches of a tree hanging over a lake. The lake belonged to a Naga king, a serpent spirit of the deep water, and her arrival enraged him. He rose from the lake with a swarming host of spirits. She didn't flee. She didn't fight. She turned toward them and offered them her body as food. And in this legend, aggression met with an offering has nothing to hold on to. The Namtar says the spirits stopped, bowed, and bound themselves to her as protectors. They came looking for resistance. They found a feast. Which raises the question this entire tradition turns on. What did Machig actually mean by demon? Sarah Harding has translated a teaching that comes down under Machig's name, and the answer in it changes the meaning of every demon in this story. A demon is not some great big black thing that scares and petrifies whoever sees it. A demon is anything that obstructs the achievement of freedom. Anything. Listen to it again. A demon can be your enemy. A demon can be your comfort. A demon, she warned, can even be a loving friend, if that love keeps you caged. By her 40s, Machig had settled at Zangri Kangmar, the Copper Mountain, and thousands came to her. Kings and lepers, monks and mothers. When a student asked her what she meant by demons, her answer named 4. Imagine 3 people in that crowd as she speaks. A trader near the front. Months ago, in a market town, he saw a face. Wanting it, and then losing it, has ruled his mind ever since. The tangible demon, the world hooking into you through the senses, desire and aversion riding in on everything you see, hear, touch. Behind him, a monk. No enemy has laid a hand on him in 20 years, but one remembered insult has become fear, then rage, then an entire courtroom inside his head, in permanent session. The intangible demon. The affliction that needs no object in front of you. The prosecution that never rests. Off to the side, a meditator who tasted bliss last spring and has spent every day since chasing that feeling, terrified of losing it. The demon of elation, clinging to the good moment. The trap of falling in love with your own progress. And then the 4th, because the 4th demon isn't in one of them, it's in all of them. The demon of ego clinging. She doesn't mean ego the way we throw the word around. Vanity, arrogance. She means the grasping that runs deeper than thought. The habit that keeps treating the self as solid, permanent, and independent, even after the mind has learned all the correct words about emptiness. She had been reciting those words since she was 8 years old. She would know. Knowing the scripture was never the cure. The 4th demon reads scripture too. Her verdict comes down to 2 lines, preserved in her lineage. As long as there is an ego, there are demons. When there is no more ego, there are no more demons either. Most heroes defeat the monster. Machig did something more unsettling. She invited it to dinner. Padmasambhava's legends turned Tibet's hostile spirits into protectors. Machig took that pattern and turned it inward. She asked what makes anything appear demonic in the first place. And before you decide she was fearless, at another point in her sacred biography, Machig looks at what she has become and calls herself a foolish woman. And Tara answers her. She tells Machig what she actually is, an emanation of the great mother of wisdom herself. Then she tells her to take the seat, to teach, and she gives her one more instruction. Don't be timid. Even the woman who fed her demons had one left whispering. Listen to it as psychology, and hers said, "Who are you to teach this?" So, her question, from the Copper Mountain to you. 4 demons, the hook in the senses, the courtroom in the head, the addiction to the high, the self that demands protection. Which one runs your life? She compressed the whole system into a single instruction, recorded by the scholar Jérôme Edu. To consider adversity as a friend, that is the instruction of Chöd. And that teaching was about to cross the Himalayas in the wrong direction. What follows comes from Machig's sacred biography. It is history, as her lineage remembers it, and it became the foundation of her tradition's authority. Decades after her mother dreamed of a heart becoming food, the men from Bodh Gaya finally reached Zangri Kangmar. They expected to examine an isolated teacher. Instead, they found a movement. The Namtar describes a gathering swollen beyond counting, as word spread that the woman of Copper Mountain would face the masters of India. The exchange moved through interpreters, question by question, in front of everyone. She answered for herself. They tested her on doctrine, she answered. They pressed into the perfection of wisdom, her home ground since the age of 8. She answered. And when the questions ran out, they pushed past scripture entirely into her past lives. She had greeted them, the story says, in their own language. When they asked how she knew it, she answered that she had been Indian in many previous lives. They pressed her. You mean you remember your past lifetimes? Yes, all of them. Then she made the move that ended the debate. Her previous body, an Indian yogi named Monlam Droob, had never decayed. It was sitting, she said, in a cave called Patari in the south of India, perfectly preserved. Go and look. A claim that couldn't be argued, only checked, against a journey of months across the entire subcontinent to a cave that held either a miracle or her humiliation. The delegation went. The Namtar records what they found. The cave, and inside it, the yogi's body, exactly as she had described. And with that, the story Tibet preserved reaches the verse that sits at the front of her tradition's understanding of itself. All the dharmas originated in India, and later spread to Tibet. Only Machig's teaching, born in Tibet, was later introduced in India and practiced there. The men arrived as skeptics and left convinced. In the lineage's memory, the teaching soon followed them south, and the river that had flowed one direction for centuries reversed around one Tibetan woman. Then came the offer. Come to India. Teach at the source, at the center of the Buddhist world. She refused. Chöd could travel south. Its home would remain Tibet, with her, on the Copper Mountain, where the teaching was only getting started. A practice associated with wandering yogis, frightening places, and lineages outside the great monasteries could easily have stayed peripheral. A footnote, a regional curiosity that died with its founder. 3 things carried it somewhere else entirely. First, the family. The children she had walked away from found their way back, to Copper Mountain, and to the teaching. Lineage histories remember several of them among the tradition's important early transmitters, and around them gathered her 4 foremost female disciples, remembered as her ornaments, carrying a distinct women's lineage of Chöd forward. The separation had broken a family. The teaching rebuilt it as a lineage. Second, the institutions came to her. Itinerant Chödpas carried the practice on the margins, sometimes feared as exorcists and treated as half-mad graveyard yogis. But the teaching proved too powerful to stay out there. Later masters, among them the third Karmapa, wrote commentaries and systematized Chöd within the great practice lineages, and forms of it eventually entered several major schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Indian scholars once crossed the mountains to challenge her. Tibetan masters spent the next 9 centuries preserving what those scholars had questioned. And third, the feast reached the present. At Zangri Kangmar itself, the seat of her later life, Lama Karma Nitan recognized an American teacher, Sultrim Alione, as one of Machig's emanations. Her book, Feeding Your Demons, carries the core insight to readers worldwide, a modern method inspired by Chöd, as she herself is careful to say, rather than the traditional practice under a new name. Tradition remembers Machig teaching from that mountain into her 90s, and look at the paintings by which the world knows her today. She's dancing, drum raised, one leg lifted mid-step, white as moonlight, and on her face, 3 eyes. The mark her mother tried to hide became how the world remembers her. Her teachings across all those years kept redirecting the same search, away from the enemy outside, toward the clinging that gives every enemy its deepest hold. The true hero in her telling was never the one who defeats 1,000 opponents. It's the one who sits down alone and cuts. The lineage she left moved from mother to children, from wanderers into institutions, from medieval Tibet into the modern world. The woman whose authority was once put on trial is now preserved by traditions that cannot imagine Chöd without her. You will probably never sit in a Tibetan charnel ground at midnight. Machig's students did. She sent them into the graveyards and the haunted valleys, into every place the rest of the world fled. But the cemetery was never the final destination. The real charnel ground travels with you. It's the memory you root your whole day around avoiding, the identity you defend so hard you've forgotten it's a defense, the part of you that would rather keep suffering than surrender its claim to being solid. The darkness could be real, the enemy could be real. Whether the demon came as a serpent king, a scandal, or a voice inside her own mind calling her foolish, Machig kept asking one question: what gave it such a hold? Never the darkness alone. The self standing inside it, whispering, I must survive this unchanged. So take the 5th instruction with you, the one a wandering master gave a young woman 1,000 years ago in a courtyard in Tibet. Go to the places that scare you, not to prove that nothing lives there, but to discover what you are still protecting. I asked you which demon runs your life. The hook in the senses, the courtroom in the head, the addiction to the high, the self that demands protection. Tell me in the comments. I'll be down there with you. And for the story of the goddess who appeared the moment Machig doubted herself, watch our video on Tara next. It's on screen now. Stay curious, stay wise.